and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. About a year ago, on the 23rd of June of 2020, Beijing introduced a national security law in Hong Kong. This in response to the mass pro-democracy protests that had turned violent. Now, the law had essentially reduced Hong Kong's judicial autonomy and made it easier to punish demonstrators and activists. It criminalizes secession, subversion, and collusion with foreign forces, with a maximum sentence life in prison. Now, it's a year since the law was enacted. More than 100 people have been arrested under its provisions. So, why exactly is Beijing so bent on crushing dissent in Hong Kong, and what does it mean for the city's future? Tonight, we're going to be discussing this with Victoria Hui. She's an associate professor in political science at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. She studies contentious politics and Hong Kong's democracy movement. She's also testified at the US Congress and has written for many reputable publications, including Foreign Affairs, the Journal of Democracy, and The Diplomat. Victoria, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Victoria, if I may begin with the headlines that we're seeing coming out of Hong Kong, headlines that say city of protest has been silenced, or democracy is dead in Hong Kong, and coupling that with activists who have raised concerns that that the Hong Kong of 2019 and the Hong Kong of even 2020 is very different from the Hong Kong post the passing of the stringent national security law. And I'm just wondering, Victoria, how do you understand the Hong Kong of today to be like?
Hong Kong today is a very sad state in a way that, the airports, the flights leaving Hong Kong, especially going to London, they're all filled. And then a lot of people, they complain that, if we decide to stay for now, then essentially every other night we're having farewell dinners. People live in fear. You also have people who have wiped out their social media presence, unfriend people who are still activists, and also making sure that some of the remarks that they said earlier are completely erased from memory so that the police cannot really search, look for evidence. It is very scary. And at the same time, you also have the only print pro-democracy newspaper was forced to shut down last month. And the entire opposition is in jail or already arrested, if not in jail and denied bail, but they are in exile. So every single person in the opposition is gone. And people who work for the government, not just civil servants, but also judges, and district councillors, they're made to make pledges. And because the government said that, there's this kind of like leaked news that the government is going to disqualify people who are pro-democracy. And if that is the case, those who are disqualified will also have to pay back all the benefits and housing and rental subsidies and everything from day one. And this also triggered a massive exodus of district councillors. So this is a very difficult situation when everyone is like, do we leave? Do we stay? What can we say? What can we not say?
Victoria, when we look at the protests, I think one of the things that struck many of us outside of Hong Kong was just the sheer volume of people on the streets. I mean, we're talking millions of people, and when the calculation was done, some people said 1/7 of the Hong Kong population or more were out on the streets. What about them? And look, you've written about this. This is going to be a problem for Beijing. It's not just the activists; it's the people too.
This is exactly why I think we are seeing this immense crackdown. I call this essentially a whole of society onslaught. It is a war on the society, on the people of Hong Kong. In fact, so you mentioned, millions of people. Hong Kong's population is about 7.4 million. On June 9, 2019, 1 million poured to the street. A week later, 2 million poured to the street. And on August 18th, another 1.7 million. So, and if some of these figures could be a bit inflated because, you cannot literally count everyone. But what we can also tell is the figure. the number of people who participated in the district council elections on November 24th, 2019. About 1.7 people, voters, voted for pro-democracy district councillors. It is actually for this reason that these guys are now subject to disqualifications if they do not themselves resign. And this is also why Beijing is rewriting all the electoral rules. They know that it is not enough to lock up all of those who are troublemakers, who are known leaders. But there are about 2 million people who provide all kinds of support, who would vote for these people who still have the courage to risk everything. They are also trying to silence civil servants, medical workers who provided medical assistance as kind of these alternative frontliners during the protests, because many people got injured. So many medical workers volunteered. Also firefighters, also social workers, lawyers. So this is pretty scary in a way that the national security law is so harsh because it is targeted at not just the known opposition figures, but the entire society.
Right. So can I ask you specifically about the new security law? I mean, it's so wide ranging, and it's made it so much easier for Beijing to punish protesters, reducing Hong Kong's autonomy. I'm just wondering how this law plays into, or how to read this law in relation to Hong Kong's mini constitution, the Basic Law. I mean, does it supersede the Hong Kong Constitution, which promises free speech and rights to protest and rights to organize, among many rights it provides for?
Exactly. I think this is essentially the problem, is that the national security law takes over, replaces the basic law. So the national security law, it criminalizes secessions, subversion, terrorism, foreign collusion. But let's look at the terrorism, what exactly it means. So people who protest by blocking the road, by causing damage to traffic lights, that counts as terrorism. And not just people who do the act, but also people who provide tools, people who transport these guys afterwards, people who provide a venue, a room for these people to talk about, what to do, or people who provide shelter, or even sometimes unknowingly. For example, there's several cases where people are arrested because they are taxi drivers taking people that the police wanted to the airport, and so they themselves got arrested. And so this is what the national security law looks like. It says that it still, abides by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Except that toward the end of the national security law, it also says that if there are any discrepancies, if there are any differences, then it is this law, the national security law, that will supersede everything else. And also it is important to keep in mind that the basic law very clearly states that Beijing security state bureaucracies and agents cannot interfere into Hong Kong's affairs. What the national security law does is to allow state secret agents, the public bureau agents, to just openly operate in Hong Kong. They now occupy 2 huge hotels as their offices, and with a US $1 billion budget just for this year, 2021 to 22.
Victoria, what is the role of Carrie Lam's government, the government of Hong Kong in this whole scenario that you paint? How important is Carrie Lam's government in playing the role of a conduit for Beijing's own agenda?
Yeah, so Hong Kong, again, the basic law promises Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. It should be Hong Kong's own people ruling Hong Kong, not Beijing, people from Beijing, except that Hong Kong has really been ruled by Beijing appointees. They are people from Hong Kong, but then they're Beijing appointees. This has always been the case. But since 2019, it's become so obvious that Beijing doesn't even trust its own appointees anymore. And so you can see that the Hong Kong police officers, especially in 2019, there was this very infamous case of white-shirted thugs attacking passengers in the Yunnan station. And afterwards, the number 1, 2 then at the time He said, "Oh, I apologize to the people of Hong Kong that, whatever we did, we fell short of Hong Kong people's expectation." Immediately after, the Police Officers Association condemned the secretary, the chief secretary, the number 2 in command in Hong Kong. Who are you to apologize on behalf of the police? We do not. If you want to apologize, you step down. Don't tell us, the police forces, what to do. And I think from that moment on, it became obvious that Carrie Lam and her government, civilian government, really was not in charge. And now we have that Chris Tang, who was in charge of the Yunnan district at the time. He was first promoted to be the commander of police, and just recently also promoted to be the chief, to be the security bureau. And then the former security bureau chief was promoted to be the number 2 in command. So the guy who earlier apologized, he was forced to step down. So this is like, you still have Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, but they listen directly to the Beijing security apparatus.
Right. Okay. There's still so much ground to cover in our conversation, Victoria, but we're going to take a quick break. Let's come back and continue this conversation. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the future of democracy in Hong Kong. We have Victoria Hui, political scientist at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, joining us tonight. I'd like to ask Victoria about the future of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is so well positioned as a financial center in the Asia region, as a global business hub and an economic powerhouse. And making reference to what you mentioned a bit earlier, that there's been an exodus, there's been people deciding whether to leave or whether to stay. And I'm just wondering how that impacts the business sentiment and Hong Kong's position as a financial hub within Asia. Have things changed on that front?
Well, yeah, so Beijing's ideal for Hong Kong is that they can stifle Hong Kong's freedom, but yet maintain Hong Kong's capitalism. In a sense, Hong Kong's international financial status on par with London and New York City. The problem is that the national security law, if Beijing wants to rein in full control of Hong Kong, that makes it very difficult. There are a lot of businesses, they are thinking, well, we operate also in Shanghai and Shenzhen and in Beijing, in other coastal cities in China. Hong Kong is becoming as bad as in the rest of China, so, it's the same thing. But the AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce, they did a survey. They found that about 42% of the respondents were planning to leave Hong Kong. And I think this is actually going to become an important factor, because it is about, if you are a service provider for data, for your Facebook and WhatsApp, if you are asked to provide the data of a few people that the police, Hong Kong police want, you are liable to providing that information. Otherwise, these providers, they themselves are subject to penalty, and also could be the chief executives are subject to other charges. And also, the officers, the staff involved, including their family members, could also get into trouble. They could also have their assets freeze. This is pretty scary stuff. So if you want to rein in Hong Kong, you actually need to rein in everyone, including the business sector. And on top of that, what kind of education, these professionals, they have the kids, if they send the kids to school, even international schools, now that they are subject to quote unquote patriotic education, they have to learn to love the national security law.
Victoria, it seems that, the rest of China, as it were, has operated under these, say, anti-democratic draconian laws, and yet China is a lightning rod for anybody who wants to invest, who wants to set up a manufacturing base. Hong Kong is part of the Greater Bay Area that I believe that China has been, wanting to develop, and that I understand is going quite well. So is the argument for Hong Kong's uniqueness undermined by the success, the economic success of mainland China, as it were?
There is no question that China has been able to do a lot of this. So the U.S. government, because they passed the Hong Kong Policy Act in response to this and the British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. Well, okay, we take your promise that Hong Kong is going to maintain its sovereignty, its own autonomy. And also there was this one country, two systems model, the rule of law and everything. So we're going to trust you, and so we're going to give Hong Kong a special economic status. And beginning from last year, the State Department said that we are going to decertify Hong Kong's autonomy. But people can also ask what has actually happened. There are sanctions imposed on certain top officials in charge of Hong Kong, but nothing. Because Beijing is betting that, well, if these US companies, they're leaving Hong Kong, they're going to suffer a lot. Now, Hong Kong used to be the gateway for China to go out to the world. Now the very presence of a lot of these international companies are now being held hostage. So you work with us or you leave. So either way, all these international companies lose. Now Beijing can still continue to leverage this because they figure that China is still the place that you can make money, you can make profits, and so the European Union, for example, early this year was still talking about a special trade agreement with China. But what I also want to say is that while people can make money in China, everyone also knows that the system itself has a lot of structural flaws, that you can make money, but at the same time, you know how corrupt the system is. Even international businesses in Hong Kong and ethnic Chinese businesses, the businessmen, they have actually been getting into trouble quite a bit that, they take your money, they take your investment and turn around and sue you for tax violation or whatnot. And then everything is gone and you're in jail. And this could happen to the international investors too.
All right, Victoria, can I ask you how the pandemic has altered the dynamics in Hong Kong? I'm just wondering whether the pandemic in any way aided Beijing because perhaps it forced protesters to stay off the street, whether or not the perception of the people of Hong Kong has changed after the pandemic, just given how Beijing has performed in terms of handling the pandemic. Did that win them any political capital?
They, again, leveraged the pandemic so remarkably well, because as soon as the pandemic started and was basically transferred to Hong Kong, the police would say that, we're going to impose social distance rules, there are going to be no protests. They said, well, because in Hong Kong, in order to protest, you have to ask for a no objection permit from the police. And the police said, no, this is not about free speech, this is all about public health. And last year on June 4th and July 1st, that was the first time they denied any permit for a protest. And so last year in Hong Kong, there was no more legal candlelight vigil in Victoria Park on June 4th. Also, no more annual protest on July 1st. It was only this year then that they said, both because of public health and because of the safety concern that you have any mass gathering. And at the same time, though, because the government is now so untrusted, the Hong Kong government wants to make sure that everyone gets the vaccine, but we heard from so many people they don't trust the government. We're not going to take the vaccine.
Victoria, was one country, two systems a pipe dream? I mean, considering Beijing's outlook on the world, it hardly recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, let alone an autonomous region like Hong Kong. That this was going to fall apart because of the logic of the way Beijing thinks about politics, and also in relation to that, whether Hong Kong's democratic future is dependent on democracy everywhere in China.
This is a very good question. So I was teaching about Hong Kong this spring semester. One student, he made a mistake. Instead of saying one country, two systems, filled out the paper, he puts down one party, two systems. I thought that was brilliant. It was because one country, two systems could technically work. It's just like federalism. You grant local autonomy to local groups, groups of populations with very different distinctive language and identity and history and culture. This could work. But federalism cannot work in a dictatorship for the same reason. So what has not worked is one party, two systems, and this one party is a Leninist party that brooks no dissent, and it allows no rule of law. It has no room for professional associations to assert the independence. They have to rein in judges. They have to rein in teachers. They have to rein in lawyers. So this is the problem that we are facing. And so in a way then, maybe, ultimately, now that China has completely turned Hong Kong into just like the rest of China, what we're seeing is with recent cases is that police officers, because you have no one to police the security officers. So you have top chief security officers involved in scandalous dinners, very expensive dinners, and then they are not held accountable.
Right. Victoria, you talked about all the activists now, being arrested, if not in jail. Jimmy Lai, one of them from the Apple newspaper. Can I ask you, when you talked about collusion with foreign forces being one of the ways this security law cracks down on dissent, what is left then in terms of help from international communities? Can international communities pressure Beijing from the outside?
This has again become a tricky issue. Yes, Jimmy Lai, one of the many charges that he has, he's also been accused of, just really nonsensical charges, like the Apple Daily newspaper in the headquarters was using the venue in some, unspecified ways. But foreign collusion, because last year he called for the US president to help Hong Kong. And then essentially what happened in 2019 was that Hong Kong people decided that, in this teenager versus superpower struggle, we cannot win. The only thing we have is Hong Kong's international status. And therefore, it is very important to appeal to the rest of the world to help Hong Kong. And Beijing, that was very successful. The US Congress passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act by the end of 2019. And Beijing's response is, well, then we're going to make all of those efforts illegal. We're going to criminalize those efforts. So this is why one of the many things that people just completely cleaning and cleansing their social media records is that, do I have anything about appealing for international assistance? But while people from Hong Kong cannot appeal for international help, but so many Hong Kongers who have left Hong Kong, and also international governments, international civil society organizations can continue to do so, doing whatever people inside Hong Kong can no longer do.
Victoria, very quick last question for you. Any silver lining, any hope for changing the situation around?
The one hope is that Hong Kong as a city this city with rule of law has been completely killed by Beijing. But Hong Kong as a place where people grew up with the memories, that has stayed in the hearts of every single Hong Kong person. So people inside Hong Kong, if they don't want to leave, they continue to hold on to that. They continue to, make sure that they form this community with the kanji joint in the street corner. People outside of Hong Kong also hold on to this hope that one day they can return to Hong Kong and restart it.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. That was political scientist Victoria Hui wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.